St. Thomas Aquinas is perhaps the most renowned Christian philosopher. He sought to reconcile faith and reason by forging a union of Christian thought and Greek philosophy. While his predecessor, St. Augustine, drew on Neoplatonism, Aquinas brought Christian faith into contact with Aristotelian philosophy that had been revived in Europe thanks to the work of Arab philosophers. His political philosophy isn't contained in any single work, but his thoughts on politics can be found alongside his writings on natural law, morality, and the good. He is perhaps the most famous for proposing 5 arguments to prove the existence of God, but his political thought has also been influential through his doctrine of natural law. He took from Aristotle the idea of the inherent goodness and naturalness of political society. God's divine law was disclosed to us through natural law, which provided the basis for politics and morality. Aquinas put forward a less pessimistic view of politics than St. Augustine. He thought that there was an important place for philosophy alongside theology, and that through our virtuous actions, we could strive towards the common good. I'm James Muldoon. I'm a lecturer in political science at the University of Exeter. This is an introduction to Thomas Aquinas' political thought. Aquinas' life. St. Thomas Aquinas was born in 1225 AD into a noble Italian family in a town near Naples in Sicily. He studied as an undergraduate at the newly founded University of Naples. His uncle was the abbot of the first Benedictine monastery at Monte Cassino, and his family wanted him to succeed his uncle to retain this power and influence. But as an act of rebellion against his family, at the age of 19, Aquinas decided he wanted to become a Dominican monk. The radical Dominican order challenged the corruption of the church and wanted to live simpler and more ascetic lives. So while it might seem like another type of Christianity, in the eyes of his wealthy family, it may as well have been like a trust fund kid joining Antifa. His aristocratic family were completely opposed to him joining the order. The Dominicans arranged for Aquinas to move to Paris, but on his journey there, his family had him kidnapped and taken back to one of their castles. He was held here as a prisoner for a year in an attempt to change his mind. As part of their plan, his brothers even hired a sex worker to attempt to seduce Aquinas out of his celibacy. But like most kidnappings and attempted brainwashings, it only strengthened Aquinas' resolve to join the order. By 1244, it was clear that his mind could not be changed, so his mother allowed him to escape, and Aquinas travelled to Paris to study under the most eminent of Dominican scholars, Albertus Magnus. Aquinas followed Magnus from Paris to Cologne, where he taught as an apprentice professor and returned to Paris to complete a master's degree in theology. In 1256, he was appointed Regent Master in Theology at Paris, where he worked for 3 years before moving to Naples, Orvieto, and finally in 1265 to Rome to serve as papal theologian. Aquinas was well versed in Greek philosophy and revived interest of Christian thought in Aristotle's philosophy. But Aristotle's philosophy offered a complete system from a metaphysics to a natural philosophy, ethics, and politics, with no obvious need for a Christian God. Aquinas' achievement was in synthesizing the Christian and Aristotelian traditions. He modified Aristotelian philosophy in light of Christian scripture and reinterpreted questions most relevant to Christianity. He taught, preached, and wrote commentaries on Christian scripture for the rest of his life, until he died in 1274. 50 years after his death, he was canonized and pronounced a saint. Aquinas' philosophical thought exerted enormous influence on Christian theology, and he is now considered one of the greatest Christian thinkers in the Western philosophical tradition. Aristotle. Aristotle proposed that we could best flourish through the use of our reason in naturally occurring political societies. He thought that the world was rationally structured and essentially comprehensible to reason. There was a controversy about the extent to which such a worldview could be compatible with Christianity. Previous Christian thinkers like St. Augustine had denounced much of Greek philosophy as ignoring the most important role of divine grace. For more information on Aristotle and St. Augustine, you can see my videos on them. But Thomas Aquinas never saw himself as a philosopher, and he often criticized philosophers for their failure to see the wisdom of Christian revelation. But he did write extensively on philosophical topics and sought to create a suitable hierarchy of our knowledge to give Christian doctrine its proper place in how we should understand the world. Aquinas also wanted to demonstrate the superiority of divine knowledge, but in a way that gave much more credit to human reason as a divine gift from God, a hierarchy of knowledge. For Aquinas, reason and faith were different ways of knowing the world that operated according to different principles. theology and matters of faith were at the top of his hierarchy of knowledge, but they didn't discredit knowledge acquired through our reason. To scorn the dictate of reason is to scorn the commandment of God. Aquinas adopted Aristotle's principle of teleology, that all living things are ordered around a final end and purpose. He gave this a Christian twist by adding that the goal of human beings was happiness through union with God. To properly know God, we required theological study and Christian scripture. This is why faith would always be number one. It was necessary for our salvation that there be a knowledge revealed by God, besides philosophical science built up by human reason. Firstly, indeed, because the human being is directed to God, as to an end that surpasses the grasp of his reason. But there are a great many truths that we could discover through philosophical inquiry and through the use of our reason. He thought that grace didn't do away with nature, but perfected it. Both theology and philosophy could discern a certain order to the universe. When properly ordered in the correct hierarchy, they complemented rather than contradicted each other. Natural law. Aquinas' account of the best political regime was based on his theory of natural law. All living things for Aquinas were created by God and given a nature which defined their essence. He gave the term eternal law to describe how God governs all creatures, including inanimate ones, by the laws of physics. In the most general sense, the world is law-governed and has been created by God to fulfill a purpose. Beings who didn't possess any rational capacity, like plants or animals, they can't disobey the eternal law because they don't have the power of free choice. They just grow, flourish, procreate, and die. But human beings were unique in that they have the capacity to act virtuously through moral decisions, which place them in a different relation to the law. Aquinas used the term natural law to describe a set of principles which appeal to our intellect and seek to guide us according to reason. Natural law provides the basis for morality and politics because it's able to guide human behavior and provide an insight into how God intended us to act. Natural law was ordained by God and could be distinguished from human law, which was the actual content of the laws of any given state. This distinction between a sphere of natural law and the actual positive laws of the state opened the ground for moral criticism of whether man-made laws were just. Natural law was universal, unchangeable, and knowable by all human beings. It could therefore serve as a benchmark for understanding justice. When we think of today's discourse of human rights, that everyone's entitled to certain protections just by virtue of being a human being, this has its basis in an idea of natural law. Aquinas believed that natural law directed us that good should be done and evil should be avoided. He defined 4 cardinal virtues of prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude. This moral philosophy of Aquinas was the starting point for how he thought about politics and the creation of the best political regime. Political order. In terms of his political philosophy, Aquinas differed significantly from his most famous Christian predecessor, St. Augustine. He rejected the idea that the state was only necessary because of human beings' wicked nature. He was convinced by Aristotle that human beings were by nature a political animal, and proposed that they were created by God to live in communities under common government. Government exists for the ordering of the common good through human law. Natural law couldn't enforce itself. There would always be some people that would disregard their rational nature and act maliciously towards others. They would need an additional coercive incentive to respect and promote the common good. To be a good citizen meant to exhibit the virtue of legal justice and to allow one's actions to be guided by the common good rather than private interest. A second idea from Augustine that he rejected was that politics in our earthly realm could never be made just. Rather than placing all hope in divine justice in an afterlife, Aquinas was more optimistic that justice could be brought about through human laws and a Christian political order. This didn't involve a theocracy of a church-led government, and he didn't think that the clergy should play a significant role in issues of political governance. He thought that the church should be open to all, while political governments were necessarily limited to certain territories and peoples. But there was a tension in his political thought about the extent to which we were obliged to follow seemingly unjust laws of a ruler. He argued that monarchs were God's representatives in their particular territories, and hence should be obeyed as creators of human law. Obedience to governments, he thought, was part of the natural order of things. But he thought that rulers were obliged to adapt their laws to be in conformity with the doctrines of the church. This also meant that the church should take precedence in matters related to faith and morality. Aquinas thought that if a command by a despot was completely opposed to natural law, then it should be called an act of violence rather than law. His definition of law was an ordinance of reason for the common good of a community. The fact that it was intended to promote the common good is one of the principal reasons subjects should consider it as both morally and legally binding. If a human law required acts that went against natural law, then we're in fact obliged to disobey. But if disobedience would cause widespread disorder or stand as a negative example to others, then in certain circumstances we should still obey. It's unclear how far he was willing to go on the right to revolt against tyranny. He wouldn't go as far as John Locke in positing a people's right to dissolve a tyrannical government, but he did go further than Locke on the right of the poor to steal if necessary, if it meant saving themselves from starvation. He didn't think property was a fundamental natural right in the same sense that Locke imagined. Best political regime. Aquinas followed Aristotle in dividing regimes into 6 basic types, based on how many ruled and whether they governed in the interests of the people. He argued that in theory monarchy would be the best form of rule because it most resembled God's rule over all things. A monarch wouldn't have to deliberate with others who might try to dilute the virtuous ideals of the ruler. He also thought that a monarchy would be less likely than an aristocracy to deteriorate into its corrupted form, but good monarchs can be hard to find. And if it did deteriorate into a tyranny, it would become the worst possible government, so certain checks and balances were necessary. He therefore recommended a more decentralized mixed regime, which adopted aspects from each of the 3 different models of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. The best practical regime should have a monarch at its head, but it should also be governed by other lesser authorities that could share the power and protect against the monarch becoming excessively corrupted. He also suggested that the multitude should play some role in selecting the monarch. They should also have the possibility of becoming lesser figures of political authority themselves. In terms of how the best regime should be structured, Aquinas was happy to allow a wide degree of cultural pluralism. He didn't think natural law provided guidelines for how every detail of a state should be organized. Natural law provided general principles of justice, and it was up to individual rulers to determine how these could be applied in different circumstances. As a result, regimes would vary considerably across time and place, which was all part of God's ordered universe. Aquinas' reconciliation between Aristotle's philosophy and Christian theology provided a new synthesis of Greek and Christian thought.